Hello, dear friends, and welcome back to this next episode on the golden age of the samurai. This part focuses on weapons and armor, and we start with a quote of Miyamoto Musashi. To master the virtue of the longsword is to govern the world and oneself. Thus the longsword is the basis of strategy. The principle is strategy by means of the longsword. If he attains the virtue with the longsword, one man can beat 10 men. Just as one man can beat 10, so 100 men can beat 1,000, and 1,000 can beat 10,000. In my strategy, one man is the same as 10,000, so this strategy is the complete warrior's craft. We have Miyamoto Musashi here, having his fortune told. He is often considered the greatest samurai who ever lived. In combat he was as effective with a wooden bokken as a steel katana. A legendary figure. So the sword was the samurai's primary weapon and a prized possession that would only leave his side upon death. It was more than just an instrument of war, though. The sword, described as the soul of the samurai, was believed to be a spiritual extension of the warrior himself. It was also a symbol of the ethos of the way of the warrior, a desire for balance, harmony, perfection. It took expert swordsmiths months to create a new sword, and only the best blades would pass muster. Here we are, 12th century Emperor Toba forges himself a new sword in this illustration here. The perfection required in the sword's manufacture was matched by the samurai's lifelong quest for the perfection in the art of sword fighting. Together, a samurai and his sword were an inseparable unit. This was even made law in 1588 when Toyotomi Hideyoshi decreed that only samurai could carry swords. From then on, the sword acted as the samurai's identity badge, setting him above and apart from other citizens. Here we have the anatomy of a sword. So once the blade had finished being polished, it was mounted with a handle, handguard, scabbard and collar. Each of these fittings was completed by a specialist artisan before the sword was presented to its new owner. So a tsuba, the job of the disc-shaped tsuba, was to prevent the warrior's hand slipping onto his own blade and to block the blades of others. Early tsuba were made of wrought iron, but solid tsuba made of softer metals became popular from the Edo period. These highly decorated tsuba often depicted scenes from nature or samurai heroes in the past. This is the habaki, the collar. The wedge-shaped collar stopped the katana from falling out of the saya and kept the fittings in place. And here is the cord. The saigo, which was designed to tie the saya to the warrior belt sash to keep it in place. It came in a variety of colours and designs representing the wearer's clan and sometimes his status and age. The saya is the scabbard, made of wood usually lacquered black. Later Edo models often featured elaborate gold leaf designs, and a loophole was included at the top for a cord to be added and sometimes a slot for a small utility knife known as a katana. And the suko handle, first the wooden handle fitted to the bottom of a samurai blade and covered in ray skin. Silk or thread was then wrapped around the handle to provide grip, and the inner diamond caps left behind between the thread covering were designed according to the artisan's particular style. So the earliest samurai swords were copies of the Chinese model, long straight sword used for stabbing. By the 8th century, Japanese swordsmiths had improved upon the design by introducing a gentle curve. This changed the action of the sword from a thrusting to a cutting weapon. By the mid-16th century, we have the katana, as it was called, considered the ultimate sword and the result of centuries of development in sword making. A samurai carried his katana in his belt sash, alongside a shorter matching companion sword, most popularly the wakizashi. And a matching set of katana and wakizashi were known as a daisho. The wakizashi used to commit to seppuku never left a samurai's belt, even in important conferences when his katana was laid to one side. The katana was worn with its cutting edge upwards to enable the extraction of the blade from its scabbard and into an enemy in one stroke. Today, a katana is still considered one of the best cutting blades in the world, easily slicing through flesh and bone. Once created, a katana was tested out by cutting through the limbs of prisoners, or in times of peace, cadavers. How grim. Often corpses were piled on top of one another on a bed of sand to see how many a katana could cut through in one slice. A good blade could cut through 3 bodies, and an exceptional one could get through 7. That is horrific, but also incredible that a blade could do that. The genius of it was its bimetallic makeup. A high carbon steel shell for cutting was wrapped around a lower carbon body which absorbed shock. And sword polishing was one part of a sword's creation and was considered a sacred art. Different gradients of sharpening stone were used in polishing. The katana derived its power from a hard cutting edge and a strong broad back. All samurai swords were two-handed weapons, and as such needed to act as a shield as well as a blade. To create a sword with a sharp cutting blade that could also absorb shock requires 2 types of steel. The high carbon shell wrapped around a softer lower carbon body. It was a genius of the samurai sword, the creation of which considered a sacred art that took years of dedicated training to perfect. It took expert swordsmiths several months to complete a samurai sword. While they made it, these swordsmiths would dress in white ceremonial clothes, perform Shinto rituals, and forego worldly pleasures. Just to create the steel for a sword was an arduous process. It took 10 men more than 3 days to smelt the carbon-rich steel pieces that would be forged into a blade. To make the steel, iron sand was poured into a 1,000-degree charcoal-fed furnace called a tatara. Then over a pivotal 72-hour period, the sand would form into pieces of crude high-carbon steel known as tamahakane. Once cooled, the tamahakane pieces were chosen for the forging process. A swordsmith would craft the steel into a new samurai blade over several weeks. His team would include smiths to forge the blade's shape, assistant smiths to fold the shape with hammers, a polisher, a blade expert, and sheath and his artisans. To create the sword, the tamahakane pieces were heated in a 1300-degree furnace and then folded up to 30 times through hammering to weld the steel together and distribute its carbon content evenly. A bar of lower carbon steel was then inserted into a U-shaped piece of high carbon steel and hammered together to form the blade's soft interior and hard shell. Once it had been hammered into the correct shape, around 60 to 80 centimeters long, it was covered in a clay paste which was then removed along the cutting edge. The blade was then reheated in the furnace and plunged into cold water. The result was a final hardening of the sword's cutting edge, and if the blade had survived this process without cracking, and not all did, it spent several days being polished. This meant being rubbed with many different grades of increasingly fine stone until the well-known wavy line that separates the hardened and unhardened steel showed, and the blade was brought to a dazzling finish. So from the moment a young samurai was given his first katana, his life would be dedicated to learning the art of swordsmanship. There was a lot to learn, starting with how to grasp the sword correctly with both hands and the different methods of drawing it from the scabbard. There was also sword etiquette, an all-important set of social rules that no samurai could afford to ignore. The most serious of these concerned scabbard's hitting, which, as the samurai sword was considered an extension of the samurai himself, was tantamount to slapping the owner in the face. To preserve his honor, the aggrieved party would be expected to retaliate by drawing his sword. Now we have different types of drawing here. Basic draw. A smooth action to release the katana from its scabbard and into a cut was of paramount importance. The overhead, slashing and cutting rather than stabbing. A downward stroke. Sideways swing. And the guard posture. And here we have a master swordsman, Miyamoto Musashi, often fought according to Nito-jutsu, or the two-sword method. Musashi argued that Nito-jutsu was the logical method for all samurai. Let it suffice to say that in our land, whatever the reason, a warrior carries 2 swords at his belt. It is the way of the warrior. So there was a famous example of scabbards hitting, described below. 2 Two officers belonging to the Emperor's staff met upon the imperial staircase. Their swords happened to entangle, and words arose. Said one to the other coolly, "It is only an accident, and at best it is only a quarrel between the two swords." "We shall see about that," cried the other excitedly, and with these words he drew his weapon and plunged it into his breast. The other, impatient to obtain the same advantage, hurried away upon some errand of service which he was slowly performing, and instantly returned to his antagonist, who was already at the point of death. On inquiring if he was still alive, and being informed of the fact, he also plunged his sword into his own body, claiming, "You should not have had the start on me if you had not found me engaged in the service of the prince. I die contented, however, since I have had the glory of convincing you that my sword is as good as yours." So as part of their training, samurai would become experts in the 16 varieties of cut, most of which would use a downward stroke. Young samurai practiced their cuts on the bodies of criminals, either dead or alive, so they could experience slicing human flesh. Hours could be devoted to learning one move. Edicts, for example, was a single smooth action that pulled the katana down from the scabbard, struck the opponent, wiped the blade clean of blood, and returned to the sword in its sheath. As well as learning basic sword fighting methods, samurai were also expected to study the techniques of others. One of the greatest masters of the samurai sword was Miyamoto Musashi, who recorded his accomplishments in Gorin no Sho, the Book of Five Rings, a manual on sword fighting strategy. Born in 1584, Musashi was an eccentric who seldom washed, was always late for duels, and often preferred to fight with a wooden bokken rather than a katana. His skill with the katana, however, meant that he could split a grain of rice on a man's forehead without drawing blood. At 15 years of age, Musashi went on a sword-fighting pilgrimage through the country, and had soon dispatched more warriors in duels than any other samurai in the history of Japan. But after killing samurai master Sasaki Kojiro in a duel using the oar from a boat, Musashi gave up dueling altogether and spent the rest of his life considering the principles of sword fighting. "When I reached 30, I looked back on my past," he said. "The previous victories were not due to my having mastered strategy. Perhaps it was natural ability, or the order of heaven, or that other school strategy was inferior. After that I studied morning and evening, searching for the principle, and then came to realize the way of strategy when I was 50. When he was 60, Musashi retired to live in a cave and write Gorin no Sho. He died in 1645 and was found sitting bolt upright with his wakizashi at the ready in his belt." Here a samurai swordsman shown alongside a naginata, the first great battlefield leveler designed to bring down a samurai on horseback. Miyamoto Musashi favored a type of swordplay called nitojutsu, or the two-sword method. In Gorin no Sho, Musashi suggests it's not difficult to wield a sword in one hand. The way to learn this is to train with two long swords, one in each hand. It will seem difficult at first, but everything is difficult at first. Musashi also gave instruction about specific cuts and moves to be used in combat, and the following examples are taken from Gorin no Sho. To hit the enemy in one timing. In one timing means when you have closed with the enemy to hit him as quickly and directly as possible, without moving your body or settling your spirit. While you feel that it is still undecided, the timing of hitting before the enemy decides to withdraw, break or hit is this in one timing. When you attack and the enemy also attacks and your swords spring together, in one action cut his head, hands and legs. When you cut several places with one sweep of the long sword, it is the continuous cut. You must practice this cut, it is often used. With detailed practice you should be able to understand it. Cut and slash. To cut and slash are two different things. Cutting, whatever form of cutting it is decisive with a resolute spirit. Slashing is nothing more than touching the enemy. Even if you slash strongly, and even if the enemy dies instantly, it is slashing. When you cut, your spirit is resolved. You must appreciate this. If you first slash the enemy's hands or legs, you must then cut strongly. Slashing is in spirit the same as touching. When you realize this to become indistinguishable, learn this well. Glue and lacquer emulsion body. The spirit of glue and lacquer emulsion body is to stick to the enemy and not separate from him. When you approach the enemy, stick firmly with your head, body and legs. People tend to advance their head and legs quickly, but their body lags behind. You should stick firmly so that there is not the slightest gap between the enemy's body and your body. You must consider this carefully. To scold, tut-tut. Scold means that when the enemy tries to countercut as you attack, you countercut again from below as if thrusting at raising your long sword as if to thrust the enemy. You must learn this through repetitive practice. Secondary weapons included the bow, which is tactically strong at the commencement of battle, especially battles on a moor, as it is possible to shoot quickly from among the spearmen. However, it's unsatisfactory in sieges or when the enemy is more than 40 yards away. For this reason, there are nowadays few traditional schools of archery. There is little use nowadays for this skill. The bow was the samurai's traditional weapon, originally fired from horseback, and was used by nobles and courtiers in hunting and archery contests. The main samurai weapons used in conjunction with the sword were the bow, naginata, spear, and arquebus. So during Japan's early Heian period, the bow, rather than the sword, was the samurai's main weapon and used primarily in mounted duels. Samurai bows were made from bamboo strips and wood, glued together, wrapped with rattan and then lacquered. So this made it strong, rigid, and tremendously hard to draw, which an archer would do using his thumb and forefinger. A further quirk was the bow's off-center grip, which meant the arrow was shot from the bow around 1/3 of the way up its shaft. This adaptation was to make it possible for a samurai to shoot from horseback and allowed the bow to keep a length of 6 feet 6 inches to 8 foot 10 inches without being shortened. Bowstrings were made from plant fiber and covered in wax. Here's a samurai with that off grip. And here's Miyamoto Yoshitsune, a famous figure of the Genpei War, armed with a bow and wearing typical 12th century armour. So it took years to train an archer to fire a bow, with required power and precision for war, and a warrior's accomplishments with a bow were therefore often celebrated. One notable example is Minamoto Tamatomo, a famous hero from the Genpei War, renowned for his skills. After being captured by the enemy, Tamatomo managed to escape punishment by decapitation, but instead had the sinew on his bow arm severed. Despite this enforced disability, Tamatomo was later reported to sink a boatload of enemy by firing an arrow through the vessel's hull from the shore. However, the bow's position as the mainstay of the samurai's arsenal would not last. For one thing, it was extraordinarily difficult to wield a bow and ride a horse at the same time, and mounted warriors needed an assistant on hand to help them. This did not fit with the Sengoku Jidai's stripped-down approach to warfare and its more efficient forms of weaponry. Mounted warriors replaced their bows with spears, and bows were relegated to lines of ashigaru. These lines would usually fire volleys at the start of a battle, as the other side launched charges against them. Of course, as we've learned time and time again in this book from the mid-16th century, arquebuses would also be used in this position, and in time they'd outnumber and overtake the bow and arrow. Arrow shafts are made of bamboo and fletched with sea eagle, hawk, or pheasant feathers. Arrowheads, or yari, were made from the same tamahagane steel used for samurai swords. And here we have some different styles. Togari-ya, which is pointed, the main battle arrow in an archer's quiver. We also have the yanagi-ba, willow leaf. So that's not shown there, but used predominantly from the mid-16th century. It had designs such as hearts, cherry blossom, or the clansmon, its emblem. Kabura-ya, hummingbird arrows used at the start of combat to signal troops, invite the attention of the gods, and inspire terror in the heart of enemies. This is the katamata, a rope cutter, used to cut lacing and ropes, hunt game, and disable horse legs. And the watakushi, barbed, to inflict terrible wounds. The naginata is inferior to the yari on the battlefield. With the yari, you can take the initiative. The naginata is defensive. In the hands of one or two men of equal ability, the spear gives it a little extra strength. Yari and naginata both have their uses, but neither is very beneficial in confined spaces. They cannot be used for taking a prisoner. They are essentially weapons for the field, says Miyamoto Musashi. This 19th century woodblock depicts a ronin deflecting arrows with his naginata. So it was a weapon that featured heavily in samurai warfare of the 12th century. It was a particularly long-term favourite of the Sohei warrior monks, who often played a starring role during the Genpei War. One such Sohei was Kujin no Tajima, whose skill with a naginata at the 1180 Battle of the Uji Bridge was recounted in the epic Genpei War chronicle, the Haika Monogatari. As we have here, Kujin no Tajima, throwing away the sheath of his long naginata, strode forth alone onto the bridge, whereupon Haika straightway shot at him fast and furious. To Tajima, not at all perturbed, ducking to avoid the higher ones and leaping over those that flew low, cut through those that flew straight with his whirring naginata, so that even the enemy looked on in admiration. Thus it was that he was dubbed Tajima the Arrow Cutter. We see many movies replicate or try to replicate that level of skill, don't we? Yari from the mid-16th century had a lacquered hardwood shaft between 4 metres and 6.5 metres long. A typical one was up to a metre long and made of the same tamahagani steel as a samurai sword. So we have a few different types as well. The Jumonji yari is a cross-shaped yari, also called the magari yari, with one straight central blade and 2 slightly curved flanking blades. The Ajiri nari yari, a spade-shaped yari featuring 2 central holes. The Tsukinari yari, a yari with a crescent-shaped blade for slashing and hooking. Sasaho yari, with a broad bamboo-shaped blade. And Sankaku yari, without a cutting edge but a strong point for penetrating armour. Here are 2 samurai grappling with a yari, which would replace naginatas on the battlefield. So the popularity of the naginata and another polearm, the yari spear, greatly increased after the failed 13th century Mongol invasion of Japan. Battles against other samurai were one thing, but when confronted by an enemy who cared little for the ritual of mounted duels or notions of honour in warfare, Japanese warriors were forced to rethink their approach. It was obvious that the least efficient way of bringing down an archer on horseback was by using another archer on horseback, so it was simpler for several ashigaru armed with naginatas to attack a rider collectively. It was the perfect weapon for unhorsing a warrior. It was also simpler for a mounted warrior to abandon his bow altogether in favour of a yari. It was constructed from a straight blade that sharpened to an end point. This made it a versatile weapon that could be used by a horseman in the fashion of a lance from medieval Europe, but also allowed for the slashing action of a naginata. Here we have a few miscellaneous weapons. The kanabo is a heavy club made of solid wood or iron with studs or spikes at one end, commonly used to break bones in the legs of horses. A hachiwara, a skull breaker, a long thin dagger used for penetrating weak points of an opponent's armour or helmet. An ono is a war axe or hatchet, favoured by the Sohei warrior months. Otsuchi, a large warhammer used in battle to break down gates. Sodegarami, known as the sleeve and dangler, a 2-metre-long polearm with barbs and spikes used as a man-catcher. And a tessen, a war fan made of iron plates that could be used to throw, fend off arrows and attack enemies. Other fans included the gunbai and the gunsen. So from the time of the Sengoku Jidai, lines of ashigaru carrying naginatas and yaris would be a mainstay of a daimyo's army. They would launch a charge against the enemy lines, often after a volley of arrows or fire by front lines of arquebus armed ashigaru and ashigaru archers. Both Oda Nobunaga and Toyotomi Hideyoshi were great advocates of the yari, with samurai of the Oda clan carrying yari over 6 metres long. 7 of Hideyoshi's generals who outdid themselves with yari at the 1583 Battle of Shizugatake became famously known as the 7 famous spearmen of Shizugatake. One of these was Kato Kiyomasa, whose skill with the yari was further demonstrated during the Korean invasion of 1592. Here, Kiyomasa famously speared a tiger while subduing the inhabitants of the country's northeast. And by the time of the 1600 Battle of Sekigahara, the yari had overtaken the naginata as the polearm of choice, and the weapon was used extensively by Tokugawa Ieyasu's front lines. It was also used to great effect during the siege of Osaka's Battle of Tennoji, the last pitched battle of the samurai. Following Ieyasu's demise and the onset of the Edo period, yari would still be manufactured, but more as a ceremonial object than a practical weapon of war. So we've heard about it a lot, but let's have a look at some. The arquebus, a collection of samurai firearms from the 18th and 19th centuries based on the Portuguese arquebuses that landed in Japan. The 2 pistols are called tansutsu, or short-barreled, only effective at short range. A standard arquebus had an optimum killing range of 30 metres, although a bullet could still pierce typical samurai armour at 50 metres. And here we have replica arquebuses fired during a reenactment. The blue burning fuse is used to ignite the charge and fire the arquebus. So, from inside fortifications, the gun has no equal among weapons. It is the supreme weapon on the field before the ranks clash, but once swords across the guns become useless, says Miyamoto Musashi. So it was the late great breakthrough in the samurai arsenal that ensured success and carnage on the battlefield in equal measures. There was little contest between a samurai bow and an arquebus. The bow had an optimum killing range of between 30 and 50 meters, the arquebus between 50 and 200. The arquebus's adoption into the ranks of Oda Nobunaga's army won the daimyo a pivotal victory at the 1575 Battle of Nagashino, guaranteed his place as the first great unifier of Japan. His secret had been to use the clumsy and slow-to-reload firearm in a rotating front line, so that a sustained volley could be maintained. These methods would be continued by his successors Hideyoshi and Ieyasu, who used the weapons to secure their domination over all the other Japanese daimyo. And while arquebus technology was extremely popular among samurai warriors, the development of cannon did not have the same reputation. Cannons were found harder to replicate than arquebuses. Those imported from Europe were considered the most effective. Japanese cannons, by comparison, were strange confections, often consisting of a large barrel tied to a cart or built on a box-like wooden stock. And while samurai cannons used in the field of battle were generally considered ineffective noisemakers, they were put to better use at sea, notably in Oda Nobunaga's 1573 siege of Nagashima. Here, cannons were crucial, destroying the castle walls and bringing an end to the siege. Totogawa Ieyasu also famously trained his cannons on the residential castle buildings at the 1614-15 siege of Osaka, but again this was more effective in straining the nerves of the inhabitants than bringing down the walls. While swordsmiths struggled with the manufacture of cannons, it didn't take them long to accurately reproduce arquebuses in large numbers following the weapon's 1543 arrival in Japan. The barrels were constructed by wrapping a long hot steel plate around a rod that was then removed. The stock was made of wood, the lock mechanism and decorative inlays of brass. The arquebus employed the matchlock system, which required the user to light a long fuse that fell into a touch hole to spark the charge. This gave the user time to take aim before the weapon fired, unlike earlier versions that required a live match to be dropped into the touch hole. Despite this small advance, an arquebus was notoriously difficult to light in the wind or rain, and its gunpowder was easily made damp and ineffective. While the arquebus played a large role in bringing about the unification of Japan and the 250 years of peace that followed, its history is short compared with that of the samurai warrior. The arquebus was used in warfare for only about 70 years and was then relegated, like most samurai weapons, to ceremonial use. The weapon was still manufactured, but its technology quickly became obsolete when Japan reopened its doors to foreigners in the 19th century. Here's a stylized image of the 1877 defeat of Saigo Takamori, often considered the last samurai. Takamori's swords were no match for modern rifles and Gatling guns. The arquebus would look utterly medieval when compared with the modern guns aboard Commodore Perry's black ships in 1852. And ironically, the very last charge of the samurai led by Saigo Takamori in 1877 would be on horseback, with swords raised high against a line of firearm-carrying army regulars. And like the Takeda cavalry charge at the 1575 Battle of Nagashino, Takamori and his men would be decimated by gunfire. It was not from a volley of arquebus musket balls delivered by a rotating front line, but instead by the rapid fire of a modern Gatling gun. Here, modern samurai armor was known as the Tosei Gosoku and replaced the earlier boxia yoroi. Tosei Gosoku armor was tailored and offered greater flexibility. And this armor, which would have belonged to a high-ranking samurai, features a Hotta face mask. The mask was designed to strike fear into the enemy. Here's Miyamoto Musashi again. So every morning the samurai of 50 or 60 years ago would bathe, shave their foreheads, put lotion in their hair, cut their fingernails and toenails, rubbing them with pumice and then with wood, sorrel, and without fail pay attention to their personal appearance. It goes without saying that their armour in general was kept free from rust, that it was dusted, shined and arranged. So The story of samurai armour is one of evolution from the early lamella suits made up of layers of plates worn by warriors on horseback to the strong Sekokujudai cuirasses constructed to withstand arquebus shot. Traditional samurai armour was known as yoroi, or great armour, designed to be worn by a mounted samurai. Typically had a box shape, weighed around 30 kilos and hung down from the shoulders. Yoroi armour took the Asiatic lamella style and was made from small iron or leather scales, tied together and then lacquered to form plates. And these horizontal plates were then tied in an overlying fashion and attached at the back with laces. So beautiful and intricate. Foot soldiers were given a simpler form of protection in the domaru, a type of armoured jacket that was held in place by a belt. A similar armour that also laced at the back was called the haramaki. The haramaki and domaru were lesser forms of armour, but offered significantly more flexibility than the yoroi, which was designed primarily for an archer, too rigid for swordplay. As a result, aspects of the three types of armour were brought together to create the Tosai Gosoku, or modern armour. The most noticeable difference between the Tosai Gosoku and the yoroi was the tailoring. Yosoku was often tapered in at the waist and was designed for the hips to share the armour's weight, rather than the shoulders alone. The most popular kind of Tosai Gosoku was the Okagawa Do, a strong, simple suit of armour designed to withstand the demands of the Sengoku Jidai. The horizontal plates made up of thousands of smaller scales had been replaced by single plates made of one piece of leather or iron. The intricate system of back lacing had also been reduced, and eventually the lacing would be replaced by steel rivets holding the plates together, either vertically or horizontally. Armour lacing had caused huge problems for them. We'll carry on in a moment as we have a look at this wearing of samurai armour section. So, we got the kabuto, the helmet, hundreds of different styles of helmet and different styles of shikoro, the neck guard hanging from the back and sides of the helmet, 3 varieties of cord to secure the helmet to the head, the hawate mask, 6 stars, all to cover the cheek and chin, and a movable nose piece is recommended. Whiskers on the mask aren't necessary, but it is desirable to have moustaches. Before putting on the mask, place a handkerchief between the mask and the chin, then fasten the ends of the cords on top of your head. The sode shoulder plates, fasten them to the do by means of hooks, and fasten first the left one and then the right, and in each case the back one before the front. Large and medium sode are only worn by important officers. Do body armor and kusazuri shirts. There are many kinds of do, and as will be seen, this piece comprises not only the back and breastplate but also the laminated skirt piece called kusazuri. The Okagawa do is put on in 6 stages from a sitting position. The kote sleeves are usually made of a textile material, often silk brocade, padded, laced with small cords upon the inside of the arm and covered with mail, small metal plates or quilting. Do not pull the laces of the kote too tightly, or the movement of the arm will be hampered. When shooting, take off your right kote. Nugage gloves are made of tanned skin, and unlined ones are recommended. In donning these, the right should be put on first. The departure from the ordinary rule is because of the superior ability of the right hand and the difficulty of tying the cords after covering the left. The uwa-obi belt slash. For this, linen and cotton cloths are recommended, wound 2 or 3 times around the body, the actual length depending upon the wearer. Fold the linen or cotton cloth into halves and then twist it and put a little piece of leather in the centre so that you can find the middle even when in a dark place. The haitate thigh guards usually consist of an apron-like piece of cloth, having its lower part covered with small overlapping plates of metal or leather. A good way to wear the haitate is to tie the cords outside it. You can then move freely and still take it off quickly. And the saniete shin guards, a popular type in the Sengoku period, consist of vertical plates connected by either hinges or chainmail, often lined with textile material. Here we have robes, simple tari robes worn under trousers and attached with laces at the knee, and straw sandals are favoured because they're easy to replace. Don't house fleas and lice. The skirt piece attached to protect the legs, and then the sleeves and gloves. Weapons are then put on. Here's haramaki armour, an armoured jacket laced up at the back, worn by foot soldiers, a lesser piece. So from the mid-16th century, crests on helmets were commonplace. Here, a replica of Hideyoshi's helmet is shown with its distinctive sunburst crest. That is crazy. Look at that. And a Kawari Kabuto decorative helmet with a mythical sea creature on top. They're amazing, aren't they? So obviously we were talking about how the armour plays havoc for those who have to wear it for weeks at a time, because when wet, the lacing made the armour much heavier and it would freeze in winter. The lacing was also difficult to wash free of the mud and filth collected on long campaigns. Suits would become infested with ants and lice and bring ill health to the wearer. The Okagawa do was practical, easy to wear and cheap to make. Because it was built with arquebuses in mind, many Okagawa do suits went onto the battlefield already displaying dents where they'd been tested against arquebus balls. It could be produced quickly because it had fewer parts at a much lower cost, and were created in great numbers for the ashigaru. The front was often lacquered with the daimyo's colours and mon's emblems, and ashigaru not wearing a Okagawa do instead favoured a piece of folding armour called tatami do, a lightweight armour consisting of small connecting pieces of square metal that were often sewn into a thick back lining, worn as a kind of armoured apron. The tatami do was tough and easy to collapse and carry when not on use. Helmets and masks, and furthermore, while ornamentation on armour is unnecessary, one should be very careful about the appearance of his helmet. It is something that accompanies his head to the enemy's camp. Thank you, Miyamoto. So although Swordmaster Miyamoto Musashi advised against the ornamentation of samurai armour, it was a trend that became more ostentatious as time went on. While warriors liked to customize their armour so they were seen on the battlefield, the use of elaborate headgear really allowed them to stand out from the mass. The samurai helmet, or kabuto, consisted of a bowl constructed from up to 32 curved plates that were riveted together. The simplest, made up of 8 plates, were called helmets for 100 heads, and as the name suggests, they were mass-produced and worn. At the other end of the scale, they were helmets of different shapes, crests, helmets with whole structures on top. Before the Sengoku Jidai, only a high-ranking samurai would attach a crest to the visor of their helmet, but from the mid-16th century, crests were commonplace. Made from papier-mâché, crests would take various shapes, including antlers, wild boars, peacock feathers, crescent moons, butterflies and stylized centipedes. The most famous was the one we saw previously, sunburst crest worn by Toyotomi Hideyoshi, making him an unmistakable figure on the field of battle. The mid-16th century also saw the rise of Kawari Kabuto, a decorative helmet only available to high-ranking samurai who could afford it. It took different shapes such as peach and acorn, often adorned with large ornamental sculptures, made from iron and wooden frames with lacquered papier-mâché, covered in extraordinary individualistic array, from fins to sea monsters, rabbit ears, crabs, cow horns. The cow horns were worn by none other than Tokugawa Ieyasu, who had the horns fitted along with the cow hair after he learned that Toyotomi referred to him as the cow of the Kanto. The famous samurai general of the Korean invasion, Kato Kiyomasa, sported a silver Kawari Kabuto with a tall, elongated fin and a red sun disk on either side. Here is there were around 6 styles of white face masks, and throat protection was often attached to the bottom of the mask as shown. The purpose of the Kawari Kabuto was to show a samurai's rank, social standing and wealth. They were also intended to intimidate the enemy, although the sculptures themselves were entirely useless in adding protection. During the Edo period of peace, Kawari Kabutos, and indeed all samurai armour, became less functional and more ceremonial. Both Kabuto and armour became even more elaborate at this time, with their main purpose being to impress others. Many suits of armour from this period even returned to the earlier laced models that had proven so hazardous on the battlefield. Face masks were commonly known as oate, and attached to the kabuto. The masks were designed primarily to intimidate an opponent, often featured a fierce expression and a sinister grinning mouth. The inside of the mask was sometimes lacquered in red to give the wearer's face a more striking hue. A moustache, made of horsehair, was often applied under the nose, and beneath this, on the underside of the chin, a hole was drilled to allow sweat to drain out. Some of the masks covered the whole face, and others just the nose, chin, and cheeks. Masks for the whole face commonly had a detachable nose, which indicates the difficulty with breathing. In most respects, masks were actually considered a hindrance to combat. They made it harder to see, or provided little protection, but they also acted as a buffer between the cords on the helmet and the underside of the wearer's chin, an area often afflicted by chafing. A mask would also allow for a plated bib called a yodarakake to be hung from the bottom. This would provide excellent protection for the throat and could be used instead of the normal nodowa, usually a type of metal ring that was attached around the throat. The nodowa was a useful piece of equipment as this story describes. In 1564, on the 7th day of the first month, 2 battles took place at Konadai in Shimosa between Hojo Ieyasu and Satomi Yoshihiro, assisted by Ota Tsukumasa near Sanrakusai, in which the Hojo forces were victorious. Ota fought desperately and had received 2 wounds when Shimizu Tarozaemon, a man noted for his strength, threw down the now weary Oda but tried in vain to cut off his head. At this, Ota cried out, "Are you flurried, sir? My neck is protected by a nodowa. Remove it and take off my head." Shimizu replied with a bow, "How kind you are to tell me. You die a noble death. You have my admiration." But just as he was about to remove the nodowa, 2 young squires of Ota rushed up and, throwing Shimizu down, enabled their master to decapitate him. Been caught monologuing. In addition to a samurai's armor and weaponry, the Tanki Yoryaku Haiko Ben recommends carrying the following equipment: a sashimono, a little flag, hundreds of different kinds generally made of silk. It's fitted into your belt. So this is depicting a samurai's family or clan. A provision bag, a kate, a bakuro. For ordinary officers, the koshizuto is recommended, made of twisted paper strings and measures about 1 foot by 9.5 inches, carried at the right side of the waist. It's advisable to carry another bag in which are 3 to 4 gu of rice, and in cold weather baked rice is recommended because it gets warm. A gunsen, a folding war fan, a light one's recommended. Hang it at your waist or to the ring at the upper part of the breastplate. When in actual fighting, do not hang it on the chest, as it's very inconvenient in using the sword or bow and arrow. These fans have the outer sticks usually of iron, the inner ones of yellow metal. A koshinawa, a rope. The kind called karauchi no himo is the best for purpose. Fasten a ring or loop to one of the ends and carry it either fastened to the sword or scabbard or on the right side of the waist. It's useful for securing a saddle, tethering a horse, or binding a prisoner. A head bag, kubibakuro, made of netting to carry the severed head of an enemy. When walking, carry it hung to your waist, and when mounted, fasten it to the saddle. That's a bit grim, isn't it? And a nagatenugu, a long towel of white cotton, attached to the sword or scabbard, used for such purposes as bandaging wounds, carrying provisions, wrapping up a bow or musket, or as a turban. A tasuki for girdling up the sleeves, or in an emergency as a substitute sashimono. Well, that was a fascinating little section there on the armour and weaponry of the samurai. It looks like our next part will be about the myth and reality of the samurai, and we'll look into some big media, which is quite exciting. Akira Kuwasara et al. Thank you very much for joining me in this exploration of the golden age of the samurai, and I look forward to having you join me next time. Until then.